Okay, so it's noon and let's get started with my presentation. I am Dr. Allie Thomas and I'm going to be talking today about do Southeastern Millennials Uber? Please let me know if you can't hear me. Just write it in one of the chat boxes and I'll make sure to speak up. And if I'm also going too fast, which I've been known to do, also let me know that as well. Okay, hold on just a sec. All right. So before I start, just want to recognize Stride, which UNC Chapel Hill is part of a consortium of 10 colleges and universities called the Stride Center. And the Stride Center is the 2016 USDOT Region 4 UTC, or University Transportation Center, with the University of Florida as the lead institution. And the overarching mission for us is to develop novel strategies to reduce congestion. All right, so this is a quick outline of my talk for today. Just give a brief overview of North Carolina, kind of talk about the context and the reasons for doing this research in particular, a short look at previous research, some discussion about my methodology, and then the results. I just want to put out one caveat. This is really more of an exploratory study. I'm doing a bigger study, hopefully within the next week it'll be launching, that looks at Florida and North Carolina and looks at two generations, Gen X and millennials. So just a little bit about North Carolina. That's where it's located, right there, southeast. Population for the entire state's only 10 million. Finance, technology, and research are some of the what's the word I'm looking for here? Our main economic drivers, but agricultural industry by large is the largest part of our economy. We're also becoming more and more popular with tech because of the quality of life and also just in general, it's cheaper to live here. But at the same time, we're not one of the more richer states. We're 36th in the nation per capita income. And I think income inequality is a big issue in our state. And because so many people are moving to these urban areas, our rural population is declining. So just a little bit of background about millennials and some of the motivations. So there's been quite a bit of research on millennials or youth in general. And the idea that millennials are more inclined to use public transit, they're more tech savvy, but these studies, by and large, have been national studies and in more traditional urban centers like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, etc. And what I wasn't seeing in a lot of the studies in terms of looking at millennials of color in particular is understanding that they're facing greater financial insecurity. As you can see, there is a major racial wealth gap. A lot of minorities, particularly Black and Hispanics, don't have the safety net of family wealth. They then are also more inclined, particularly African Americans, to have a higher student debt. And we're seeing this in many commentaries. And so it's been mostly anecdotal, but recently, the USDOT has looked at, has done a study looking at this. And a couple of their findings are what we might expect, that with each increase in the unit of debt, will likely result in approximately 1.2% decrease in the amount that individuals spend on transportation as a share of total household expenditures. So it's particularly for low-income millennials, they're seeing spending going down significantly as loans go up. This isn't surprising, but this is one of the first, I think, studies that actually looked at it from this perspective of looking at millennial student loan debt in particular. Okay. So previous studies that I looked at, and these are just a few of them, but overall, like I said, they looked at nationally what's happening, what are the travel patterns, what's happening in terms of, the transportation land use connection, and how does that influence people's travel behavior, particularly youth. And then you have Klein & Smart looking at car ownership and how looking through panel data, household panel data over time, seeing particularly in minority households, low-income households in particular, that car ownership itself goes in and out as well. So overall, the picture isn't necessarily that all millennials love public transit, but in general that there seems to be a connection between economics and car ownership, um, land use, and travel, and maybe they're really just not that different from other generations. Again, we're looking at this at national level, and so we don't know necessarily geographically what this looks like in places like North Carolina. For the regional studies, there's two that I've seen. There may be more that have come out since, um, but you have the California study, and they're looking to do that to be a longitudinal and come back and look at different um, respondents and how they've changed over time. But this is the first phase that I looked at. And then the second study, which is by Vilcock and Witt, looked at small and urban and rural areas. And they looked at four states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Washington, and Montana. So that one was a little bit more closer to what we're dealing with in North Carolina with these counties that incorporate both suburban and rural areas as well as urban. Um, and in both cases, there's an assumption about the use of ride hailing in particular. Usually, more educated, white, etc. Um, but not really getting into, and neither of them really have a large Black population. And in particular for me, looking at African Americans and millennials, because they make up a large percentage of the Black population, I think it's important to actually look at what's happening to African American millennials. And looking at the share of populations that are millennial, North Carolina is one of them. This comes from Brookings, and they found that 40 to 50% are millennials for North Carolina. The other thing to kind of think about too is in terms of when we talk about urban areas, even places like Charlotte, which is one of our largest cities, we got walk scores of 20, 26 out of 100. Walkability is important to millennials, but in terms of our actual urban form in North Carolina, it still may not be as walkable as what you see in other more traditional types of urban areas. And I want to talk a little bit about densities in particular, because often we look at densities looking at the population over the total land use. And just give you, again, a context about what's happening in terms of landform in North Carolina, understanding what our transit service looks like, and that's based on our traditional understanding of population density, et cetera. But I use a different methodology to calculate densities, looking at the percentage or the number of people that live at these specific densities. And in general, overall, North Carolina is seen as about 1,200 people per square mile. But in reality, in these counties, and these are counties that I targeted for this research, you can see that the densities go up and down. Charlotte, which is in Mecklenburg, that's the green. A large percentage do live at 3,000, but to have higher frequency bus service requires to have densities about 5,000. So we're just, we're not necessarily a very dense area, even in our larger counties. So that bus service is also limited. This could also, prove to be a reason why there is such ride-hailing use in the South, but it also explains why there is some difficulties if you don't have a car in getting a job or keeping a job as well. So let me get to the methodology. So taking all that in consideration, we did an online survey using Qualtrics. We have 50 questions. We took the Pew Center's definition of millennial. We looked at two groups, employed and students. We did a non-proportional quota sampling. So basically, I had about a few $1,000s, not a lot. So that's why I also didn't do a comparison between other geographic regions, meaning like state to state, and also why I didn't do other generations. I wanted to just see what millennials were doing. It's more of an exploratory study because again, in my next phase, I'll have a larger study that's more state to state, and we can see what's happening in terms of also new types of ride sharing modes, or sorry, sharing modes in terms of scooters and bikes, et cetera, that have taken off in this area as well. Um, and then we collected responses over about a month in 2018. And as I said, I had some budget limitations. Okay, so this is what is the racial and ethnic makeup of the respondents. And then that's the racial and ethnic makeup of North Carolina. So you can see that even if I was going to try and do a representative sample, the numbers would not be strong enough to really do cross comparisons between whites, blacks, and Hispanics, and also looking at gender. Whoops, okay. And then also to show you like the diversity within those counties. These are the counties that we surveyed. And then Wake, Mecklenburg, Durham, and Cumberland, as you can see, they're about 50% minority, 50% white. And that's where we got a good portion of our respondents. So just give you some background on the respondents and their employment status. 70% are employed, 8% are stay at home, they manage households, 10% are unemployed, and 9% are full-time students. And of those, 45% work. We're not talking about a large student population, but I just included that as a way of kind of separating because the students were, sorry, not the students, the respondents could be at an age where they were just graduating. They may have had another year left in school. So I wanted to make sure we had that as a option. So in terms of gender, this is common, majority female, and not much, I mean, Hispanic population is about 50-50. Now these numbers are different from what I showed you because I had not taken out Hispanic whites and Hispanic blacks. So these are now everyone's separated, and that's what the percentages are. And the numbers are 205 white, 189 black, and 175 Hispanic. So I had a total of 623. So looking at living arrangements, one of the things that's popped up in other research is this idea of dependence. And what we found is that of the number of respondents that are non-Hispanic black, 26% of them are living with their family. But one of the things we looked at was we also asked them a follow-up question. What are the reasons for living with family? We gave them some selections. The responses for them were rents are high, but another response was to help out family. So, and again, what I also found with this dependent group or multi-generational group is that they also worked. And so there's a whole bunch of information we kind of need to like take out of this group and look at like who's really depending on living with their parents and who is actually there to help their parents economically, or even to help them out in terms of care. We're seeing the sandwich generation where people have children and also are taking care of their parents. This is becoming a bigger phenomenon. So this is something that we're also seeing even with millennials coming up, particularly, and I can't remember age, we're not talking about a lot of people, but it doesn't seem to be, as I recall, and I'll check, it's not necessarily older millennials. It was a mix of ages that were living at home. And then average household size, it's slightly larger for Hispanic families, and then also those who are multi-generational. But to be clear, most number of people who are living in multi-generational families were actually African-American. The other thing is to look at household vehicles, and I will point out later in another slide, and I think it's my next slide actually. One of the things I think I'm going to start looking at more in the next iteration is not just zero vehicles households, but also 0 to 1, particularly if children are there, and also if the household size is larger. For 0, we see just a constant pattern that we've seen historically for African Americans is 16% has zero car households, meaning they had no car in the house, they had no access to a car in the house, like there's no car. And because we also asked a follow-up question, you know, and in terms of asking, like, do you have a car? It means, do you have a car? Do you have access to a car that somebody else has in your house? You know, we're very explicit. So this is, they have no access to any car. There's no car in their house. But this does go down to about 7%, I believe, or um, when you look at if they have cars outside of the house. So they are borrowing cars. And this is, you know, echoing other types of research that have looked at how people will ask for cars, borrow cars, figure out ways to strategize to get to different places. So bear with me with this slide. It's not the prettiest. I'll walk you through it. But I just was crunching some data because I was looking at this more closely, particularly the role of family and car ownership. What was interesting is when you look at Black families with children, 44% have 0 to 1, and 16% of this is 0, okay? And then even with children, it doesn't really increase that much between those who have, you know, 2 cars and those who have 1 car. But what you notice is, like, of course, when there's no children, you know, there's just 1 car through adults, but it doesn't seem to really decrease that much even with children. So I'm finding that, you know, this needs to be more researched, and I'll ask more follow-up questions in the next survey about this. But it's interesting to see that, you know, economic insecurities and differences play out even when we see often if someone has a child, they're going to have a car. It's not necessarily as big a leap as you see with white families or even Hispanic families. Um, so you see that it's a large increase once there's children. Households without children, you know, it's not too many have 2. But once they have 2, once they have a child, they have 2 cars. And we're not seeing that leap with African Americans. Again, I'm not making any grand assumptions here. I'm just thinking about hypotheses that could be made in terms of income, and also things to do further exploration in my next survey. The other thing, in terms of employment, we also have issues around African Americans and unemployment. Now, if we think about car ownership and unemployment, this is, you know, there's definitely a connection because you can only get to so many jobs. And again, going back to thinking about the quality of transit service, it's not uncommon in North Carolina to wait every half hour to an hour in some areas for bus service. And we also do a pulse out. So that means everyone has to go back to the bus hub and then out to another line. So connecting to other places, if you miss your bus, you could be there for another hour in some cases. So again, not having a car and, you know, the link between that and economic opportunity is pretty clear. But again, I'm just saying that there seems to be a relationship at this point. More has to be done in terms of research, but it's definitely popping up in that direction. So in terms of how they get to work, 79% drive alone. And North Carolina has a high rate of single occupancy vehicles drive alone to work. I think it's in the 80s. 52% said that they could use public transit, but service hours and transfers kept them from using it. So here's an opportunity, I think, that's really important, is that millennials, and a lot of them stated this, were very clear about how to get to their job using public transit. So it's not a thing of they don't know how to use it, they don't want to use it. It's they obviously have looked at it and said, there's no way I'm going to take a trip that's, you know, only, you know, 20 minutes by car and it's an hour and a half by bus. And this is not an exaggeration. Depending on the hours, depending on the route, it could take you that long for a very short, straight A to B kind of trip because you have of the way that the bus routes work in North Carolina. And so just in terms of breakdown by race and ethnicity, you can see that, again, most people are driving, public transit is about the same. But it's not necessarily bad because, it's higher than the national in terms of getting public transit. And some people are walking as well. And there's biking. There are people that bike, particularly students. You can see students are taking public transit and they're walking because they're usually living closer to their campuses. And that's also from questions we asked as far as like, how far are you from your school, from your work, etc. Um, One of the things that is important, and this has also been studied, that universities make a really big impact on people's future travel. And so what we saw was we asked, what did you previously use to get around before you got to college? And again, this number is quite, this is only 50 or 60 people that are answering this, but 60% were using cars, and now only 47%, a decrease of 13. And now more people are using public transit, right? Slightly less than what they did before. And they are also, you've got, and again, the number's small, so the numbers are going to go up, but we do see that people are doing online schools, scooters, and none of the above. They didn't answer what it was exactly. So do they Uber, right? Because that's why you're all here. Yes, they do Uber. They Uber quite a bit. 30% of Blacks, 42% of Hispanics, and 25% of whites are frequent users, meaning it's either daily or weekly. And this is very interesting. This is different from what we see. The idea that, and I looked at other data as well, the idea that education has any impact doesn't seem to be what's showing in my cohort of people that I surveyed. Again, there's limitations to this because there are people who are part of Qualtrics. They may be more educated, but again, there doesn't seem to be a difference. What is interesting is with these frequent users, asking them, what they used their last trip for is work. So this paints a picture, again, it's a hypothesis because there needs to be more research, but let's think about this. If you don't have a secure access to a vehicle, and particularly in households that maybe only have 1 or 0 vehicles, you need to get to work. Your job may not be a 9 to 5. Bus service is not that great. You're going to rely on maybe a ride hailing a little bit more than other people. So Hispanics and Blacks are more likely to use, in some cases, it seems, to get to work. And this is the last trip they took. So this isn't saying like every time they go to work, they're using it, but in terms of like what, they all mainly use it for is entertainment. So going to movies, going out to drink, that kind of stuff. But there is definitely a higher percentage of use for work. And, that comes down to wanting to get to work on time, wanting to make sure they get there. Now, one of the things I'm going to look at again in the next iteration of this survey is how long did they have to wait for their Uber? Something that's different between urban areas here and in maybe other states is that in some cases you wait 10 minutes before you can get an Uber, depending on where you live. In downtown Durham, not so much, but if you're in places like Chapel Hill, and particularly if it's, even a busier time or even summer, you could wait up to 10 minutes for an Uber. So these are things to think about as well, but it's still that person's going to show up and you're going to be able to get to work. But it is something to consider because we don't have the same quality of service. We also don't have the same choices in many of the cities in North Carolina. There's no, different types of like carpooling types of Uber or Lyft. And when I asked about the types of services they used, I did ask, did you use Uber? Did you use Lyft? Uber and Lyft, whatever. And so some people are strictly Uber, some people are strictly Lyft, some people use both. But that's what these numbers are saying, is that they do know them, they use them. There's not much difference between older and younger millennials. And they're also, because again, we've been having a lot more ride sharing, they've also, I think about 20% have used different types of ride sharing, including bike sharing, some scooter. We now have more scooters. That's been a big thing in North Carolina. A lot of cities have figured out their local zoning and so forth. And so there are now more e-scooters available as well. And the other thing I'm going to be looking at, and again, is with food delivery service. So we're going to look at just pure delivery service. I was able to talk to Giovanni over in California, and I got his questionnaire for the California survey. So I want to do some comparisons around delivery services, comparing Californians and millennials and Gen X in Florida and North Carolina. But I just used food delivery service because it seemed to be quite popular. And we're seeing that they use a lot of food service. And I looked at like even ride sharing users and how often they used food service. And most of them have been using it in the past 30 days. Um, and uh, and if you look at the frequency, like a good 69% are using this kind of delivery service for food. And that could be anything from Uber Eats to delivery of, groceries. But in the next iteration, I'm going to start looking at their habits in terms of deliveries of things from Amazon, from various kinds of stores, what types of products, because I think particularly in areas like North Carolina and Florida, in some of these cities, we don't have a very dense road network. So adding more cars for delivery, we're going to see congestion a lot quicker than in some of the other cities. Um, and it is something that cities are going to have to think about in terms of all of these delivery services and freight, et cetera. So my main findings for this are that, excuse me, millennials to use ride hailing, they use it quite a bit. There's no differences between the race. Hispanics use it most frequently in terms of like specifically on a weekly basis. But also they're familiar with public transit. So they are open to it. And again, many of them said they would use it if it was more convenient. I think though that in terms of any type of public transit, it's not going to be just having better service. It's also going to be having to provide incentives for people to use public service. So you need to have the types of support that we give to cars with public transit, right? In terms of making it so that it is an attractive alternative. And then I want to do more further research on the 0 to 1 car households and children, because I find that to be an interesting type of problem, particularly for millennials, that, and particularly for African American households, that even with the increase in children, there isn't the ability to have a car. And particularly in places like North Carolina, cars are actually quite required, and it's very difficult to get around and to get to places, errands, etc. I'm also concerned in terms of the findings of the amount of delivery service that's happening with millennials. And so again, in the next steps, I'll be looking at what types of things are being delivered, how often they're using it, as well as also looking at the quality of ride hailing services that millennials and Gen X have, and seeing if there's any differences between the generations. I also want to point out that I did ask about using the use of cell phones, the use of social media, and there was no differences. Most people have cell phones, smartphones, and most people are using social media and using their phones for everything, pretty much. There was no differences amongst the different race and ethnicities. And so with that, I'll take questions, but I just want to make sure that you know that there's a short survey. Here's the link to it. Please complete this brief survey to help us plan future webinars. And then with that, if you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, so if there's no questions, I just want to let you guys know that I'll be doing the larger study. Hopefully next week it'll be launched. There's been some bureaucratic issues is the easier way to say it. The larger study will look at both North Carolina and Florida, and we'll look at Gen X and millennials. I'll also be taking some questions from the California survey to look at attitudes towards the environment, technology, to do a cross comparison, as well as also looking at habits around delivery services. And if you have any questions or suggestions or remarks that you maybe don't feel comfortable putting into the webinar, because it is recorded, feel free to email me at elena.adu, sorry, .ad.unc.edu, and let me know if you have any suggestions, follow-up, etc. And then one last thing, our next Stride webinar will be on March 11th, as you can see, and it's going to look at performance measurement and management using connected and automated vehicle data. Dr. Mohammed Ahadi from Florida International University will be doing that. And as you can see, they're going to have further presentations in April as well as May and June. And so if there's no questions, thank you for being here at my webinar. And again, I'll go back up to my contact. And again, you can also just find me at the UNC Department of City and Regional Planning website as well. And you can email me if you've got any comments or questions. And that's it. All right. Have a good day. Thanks again for joining us. And I'm out. Bye.